Now, this sounds very obscure, and in some ways it is, but it's also quite significant. What it does is that it basically provides a legal framework for Japanese forces visiting Australia and Australian forces visiting Japan. It's a necessary precondition for really intensifying military cooperation, for ramping up training exercises between the two countries. And it's also noteworthy because almost no countries have agreements like this with Japan. In fact, the only one that's been struck post-World War II is the one that it struck in 1960 with the United States.
Where they may not be on the same page, Stephen, is where Prime Minister Suga is pushing to be carbon neutral by 2050. Now, we have a lot of trade between the two countries that plays into our energy model. How do you think that's going to have to change?
Yeah, this is a fascinating development. Of course, Japan has joined a number of Australia's big trading partners in unveiling a net zero by 2050 ambition. Now, that has big implications for Australia, of course, because Japan has got a ravenous appetite for Australian resources, including LNG and coal. So if Japan does mean this seriously, if it does actually move towards net zero, then presumably that means awfully less Australian coal and LNG being shipped across the oceans to Japan. So the Prime Minister on this trip has held a number of discussions with business leaders. He's been spruiking hydrogen as a new possibility, a new form of energy that could be exported from Australia to Japan. He insists that so-called traditional methods of energy are still going to be a big part of the trade between the two countries. Whether that's true or not really depends just how serious Japan is about this net zero commitment. If they are serious, then I think you will see drastic tailing off over the next sort of 2 or 3 decades when it comes to Australian resource imports.
And it's no secret, of course, that China's been punishing Australia over a number of export markets. How do you think Beijing is viewing the closer relationship forming between Japan and Australia?
Look, I suspect China is not at all surprised by this visit. They know that Australia has been drawing increasingly close to Japan. They're probably less suspicious about the Australia-Japan relationship and more suspicious of the US relationship with countries like Japan, Australia and India. And in particular, they remain very suspicious about any formal or informal groupings between countries, in particular those four in the region. The so-called Quad is the main example of that. China sees that as an attempt to essentially contain it and to try and limit its rise. Now, I think there are many things that are probably driving that closer cooperation between Australia and Japan, as well as those other democracies that I mentioned. It's not solely China, but Beijing's expansionism in places like the South China Sea and the East China Sea, its increasingly assertive, sometimes aggressive behaviour, has, there's no doubt about it, been a major source of ballast for those new relationships. It's one of the main forces that's really driving this closer collaboration. And I think we're seeing that also in the Reciprocal Access Agreement. Traditionally, Japan looked basically only to the US. When the US was the dominant superpower, it probably didn't need to worry about striking agreements with other powers. But that, along with the status quo and the balance of power, is shifting. And that's why we're seeing this intensifying cooperation, I think, between Japan and Australia.
And Stephen, why did the Prime Minister call off his trip to Papua New Guinea?
Well, basically, because of the political chaos in PNG. The Prime Minister announced only last week that he was going, though it had been in the works for a little while. And then it was basically the day after that the opposition pulled this extraordinary move in PNG's parliament. We saw a mass defection of MPs from James Marape's government and a serious threat to his power. Now, in the wake of that, it was going to be very difficult for Scott Morrison to travel to PNG. He'd already, to some extent, been pulled into that domestic political drama when the opposition leader in PNG accused him of planning the trip to prop up Mr. Marape. Now, we're told that Mr. Marape rung Mr. Morrison on the weekend and asked him not to come. If that's the case, then you can imagine it would have caused quite a bit of relief in Canberra, because the last thing that Mr. Morrison would want to do would be to wade into a domestic political drama. And given the chaos that we see in Port Moresby at the moment, that would have been unavoidable. Though it is worth noting, Beverly, that in the last day or so, Mr. Marape is fighting back. He's trying to regain numbers, so don't write him off quite yet.
No, we'll watch and see with interest. Thanks, Stephen, so much.